Hi, everyone. I am going to share a little bit about Christianity. And so we'll jump right in. Um, Christianity is interesting in that it is such a powerful religion throughout so much of the past 2,000 years. And it's interesting because it's kind of what most of us know. And I think that that's an important thing to focus on because um, it's what we deal with. As far as Christianity goes, um, we can't really go past the Bible, and we can't get past the New Testament. The New Testament is often referred to as the Christian scriptures, and it's divided up into four sections. The Gospels, there are four of them. The Acts of the Apostles, which is the story of the early church as it develops out of the Gospels and out of this when Jesus was alive. Um, then a number of 21 different letters or epistles, which I thought was really funny when I was a little kid. And lastly, the Book of Revelation, which I want to deal with right away out of the chute. It is not uh, a guide to the end of the world, as some people feel like they have to have this as a hobby. The Book of Revelation is really a letter from one second century Christian community that was persecuted and under you know the murders and all kinds of attack to another Christian community that was going through the same thing. So just like when you were in third grade, maybe you had like a code that you had with a best friend where A equals like triangle and B equals squiggle, right? And you would go ahead and you would pass notes with this code and you'd hope that the teacher would grab it and say, I got it now. Now I'm going to find out what you were writing about me. And then she can't, because like she doesn't have the key, right? And only you and your friend had the key. Well, this is what the book of Revelation is like. There's a whole bunch of symbols and ideas here that we don't really know because we don't have the key. We don't know what that Christian community was writing to the other one because they didn't want to get taken in the wrong hands, right? And so that's what we're left with is this beautiful book of poetry of symbols. But that's about all it really is. Real scholars believe that that's about what we've got with Revelation, and it's beautiful writing like the Psalms. But I think it's important to understand the type of literature. You can't really just look at it as this objectifying way of looking at everything. I know that when we are writing a biology of George Washington, many of you know the story about him having um, chopping down his father's cherry trees, and his father comes home, "Who chopped down my cherry trees?" And he's like, "I cannot tell a lie, father. I did, right?" But that never happened, right? So if you were to go put into a biography, some people would be like, "How dare you? What a pack of lies!" Right? And other people, if you didn't put it in there, be like, "Oh, I missed that story," because and back in the first century, that's really all they really dealt with is they were not afraid to use exaggeration. Being historically accurate was not important at all to the first century. It was more like trying to tell a story, a good story that communicated not like the history of what a person did, but who was the essence of the person, what was the person really about. And that's really what the gospels are, and I think that's the most important thing to worry about. um, the next thing that I want to deal with is this two source theory. Let's talk about these books and when they were written, how do we know that, and all kinds of stuff. All right, the first thing that we realize is that the Gospels were not written while Jesus was around. They were written much later because they believed that Jesus was going to return again. The second coming was a thing early on, and so they figured, well, I don't have to write anything down. He's going to be back next week. And then next week turned into the following week, and then people died, and people who were around Jesus started dying, and they're like, oh, we should pass along these stories. And then somebody's like, we better write these down. We're starting to forget them. So they wrote them down, and that's where these Gospels came from. The first were the epistles, these letters that were written by the actual Saint Paul, who who was wandering around from community to community, starting up Christian communities and writing back to the ones he had been to, either to yell at them or to tell them, "Hey, you're doing a great job, keep it up." The first of the Gospels that we know is the Gospel of Mark, and was probably written between 60 and 70 AD. You go down the list there, it's Matthew and Luke, 75 to 85, not written anywhere near each other. in the Roman world, but they were written about the same time. And John, much later in 90 to 120. How do we know that? How do we know when they were written? Was there copyright date? Of course not. And so um, what you do is you go and you figure out like what is the writing style and what is the idioms and what is the slang, right? And so if I were to pick up a book and it was like, hey man, groovy, let's head down to the to the park, man, and protest, you'd be like, okay, so that's from the 60s, and we even use it, we talk about it as like a decade. And that's what we have here with Mark and Matthew and Luke, is these decades, right? That we think, because we've taken those scriptures and we compared them to other literature, and we say, okay, so that's how that works. And so then we look at what is this two source theory or two source hypothesis. So we look at the Gospels and we see that there's some stories and other things that are in Mark and Matthew and Luke, right? They're all very similar. They're called the synoptics, as you see there. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptics. John's got a whole bunch of other stuff that's completely different, but they have a lot of the similarities. And because Mark was written before, um, in 60 to 70 AD, scholars believe that Matthew and Luke, when they sat down in other parts of the Roman world, both sat down with of a copy of Mark down in front of them to borrow the stories from. And they took Mark's bare bone stories and they expand them and they add different kind of themes and stuff like that to them. We'll talk about that later. Um, and so Matthew and Luke both had some parts from Mark, but then they also noticed that there was stuff in Matthew and Luke that was not in Mark. And they're like, well, where did that come from? Maybe just like they had Mark, they had this other, I don't know, this other source where they were borrowing it from. And they came up with a really creative name for it, source, quelle. And so the Q source kind of came into scholarly ideas. And so as you can see in the picture there, Matthew and Luke, it's believed, not only had a copy of Mark, but they also had a copy of Q as they sat down and wrote their Gospels. And this is the two source theory. The Acts of the Apostles was probably written by Luke. It's like a part two. John, you see there, it's not a decade, it's like 30 years. And what that tells us is there's a number of different kinds of slang and different words and phrases that are used. So scholars believe it was probably put together over the course of 30 years by a number of different people, not just one writer. The themes are not like consistent either. So you have multiple authors with different themes, and that's what John's all about. The last thing I kind of want to mention here is the symbols. Um, each of these gospels has a famous symbol, and you might see them in churches and stuff like that. And maybe you never saw a man, maybe you've seen a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle like in your churches, and you're like, well, what is that? Or maybe from now on you'll notice it. And these are the symbols for the four gospels. And they came about when, in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, when basically only the priests were literate, and they had their little helpers, the little scribes, and they'd say, "Oh, go get the Gospel of Luke," and he'd run over, "Okay, okay," and they'd be like, "Oh, which one is it?" Because he was illiterate. So they're like, "Okay." So they put like little pictures on the scrolls so that they would know which one to go get. And these symbols of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had these symbols. And where did they come up with these symbols? It was basically simply, how did they start? Matthew starts with a genealogy. So this one was the father of this one, was the father of this one, was the father of this one. And so they put a man. Mark starts with John the Baptist, and there's prophecy about um, John roaring in the desert like a lion. And so that's where that comes from. Gospel of Luke starts in the temple, where Zechariah is offering a sacrifice. And ox was the highest form of sacrifice in the temple you could do. And lastly, John um, is the eagle, because he starts with some philosophical language that is very, very high above most people's ability to truly understand what it was. So these are the first few slides. We'll see how this goes, and I'll move to the next video after this.